welcome to Live Happy, Eat Dirty, a podcast full of quick and dirty health and diet ideas for real people, hosted by me, Kate Harrison. Keep listening for the latest weird and wonderful ideas and interviews from the worlds of psychology, nutrition and more. If you loathe detoxes and clean eating, but love evidence-based tips and eating well, you're in the right place. Because you can be slim without giving up cheese, you can be fit without ever trying a triathlon, and you can enjoy your life without having to be a saint. Ditch the guilt. A happy, dirty life is so much more fun. Here's today's show. Hello and welcome to episode 3 of Live Happy, Eat Dirty, and today we're going to be talking about your daily bread. My goodness, bread has had some really bad publicity over the last decade or so, along with gluten. Today we're going to be talking a lot about that with somebody who really knows her stuff. Frances Reid runs the bakery at number 55 in Cambridgeshire, and she really helped with the section I've included in the Dirty Diet book about making your sourdough. It's so interesting hearing about how old traditional methods of making bread are coming back in, and not only do they taste fantastic, but we tolerate them much better too. They can be far easier. If your digestion struggles at all with bread, this could be the way to go. I've got a whole section in the Dirty Diet, Ditch the Guilt, Love Your Food, about fermented foods. This is because we're starting to realise how important the friendly bacteria are in our guts and also acting within the foods before they enter the body. They can be a really good way of pre-digesting certain ingredients and certain foodstuffs that our bodies can struggle a bit with, but our bacteria inside our guts, the microbes that do loads of work for us, really need. And sourdough is slightly different from the other ones we've got in the book, in that the digestion is going on before it enters the body. So we're looking at friendly and good bacteria that help to break down some of the substances within bread and grains that our digestion can struggle with. And that pre-digestion means that it's much easier for us to tolerate. All the friendly bacteria that were in the sourdough starter are then actually destroyed by the cooking process. High heats mean that they couldn't possibly survive. But that pre-digestion, the slow making and proving of bread, can have really good benefits as well as to taste fantastic. It's not the only fermented food that I look at within the Dirty Diet. We've also got yogurt, which is the one most of us will be familiar with the fantastic lactobacilli bacteria, which can be really beneficial to our systems. Kefir, another form of fermented milk, can also have water kefir, but milk kefir is the one that we really recommend. Can also be tolerated by some people who have a lactose intolerance otherwise. And a great one for anyone, whatever their dietary needs, is the kind of fermented pickles that can also be really rich in these friendly bacteria and are so easy to make, not to mention really therapeutic because they involve lots of pounding and squishing of vegetables with your hands. I love making them. Lots of guidance in the Dirty Diet about that. But when it came to baking my own sourdough for the first time, it was quite a process, and it was Frances that I turned to for information. I will say that now I don't exclusively make my own bread or anything like that. It's just not practical for me. Often than not, I'm eating bread that comes from a bakery that I know quite well, that's just around the corner. I know about their methods. I know about the ingredients that go into it and the fact that they're not adding lots of extra things that really aren't necessary. But understanding the process of sourdough and creating a starter just from the bacteria that are in the air really helped me to understand the potential benefits. And it is something I still do on occasion when I feel in the mood for doing something really hands-on. Frances is also fascinating because of her background, but enough of talking about her. Let's actually hear from her in the interview. Welcome, Frances Reid, sourdough baker and teacher extraordinaire. Just to introduce Frances, first of all, she lives in Cambridgeshire. She worked for the BBC for 14 years and then in the charity sector, co-founding Target Ovarian Cancer. And then in 2015, she founded the bakery at number 55, which is a home-based village bakery.
And she's really helped out with the sourdough section of the Dirty Diet book. So I'm delighted to be able to talk to her in a little bit more depth about that today. Frances, first of all, tell me how you got interested in sourdough.
It was a bit of a slow burn, to be honest. I'd always enjoyed baking. My daughter, teenage daughter at the time, also enjoyed baking, and I didn't want to stop her. She loved making cakes and things, and I was sort of like, well, what am I going to do? I like doing it for sort of stress relaxation, reducing stress. And I went on a bread course, yeasted bread course for a day, Betty's in Harrogate, which is roughly where I hail from many years ago. And I absolutely loved it. And from that day to this, which is quite a long time now, we have only ever bought 2 loaves of bread since that time. So I started making bread and I started experimenting. And the experiments got a bit out of control. And anyway, long and short of it was, I have a friend in Holland who runs a community bakery. She works 4 days a week, and on the 5th day she bakes for neighbours, all to order, so there's no waste. And I always said, that's a brilliant idea. And she said, well, come on over. Now you've got all this time, come on over, help me out. So off I went, had a fab weekend, lots of catching up to do. And she got me started on sourdoughs. I was a bit like, okay, to start with. And then I came home and I thought, could I do what she does where I am? And I just thought, I've spent my whole life strategizing about things. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go with the flow and see where it takes me. And I invited some friends and neighbours round, baked about, I think, 12, 15 different types of bread, including some sourdough. And that's how it started. My love of sourdough has grown though since that time, since I started the bakery. I was quite nervous to start with, and just over the years I've got more and more confident and learned that you just have to go with the feel, you have to go with the flow, don't fret too much, keep trying, and it should come right soon for you.
You did this massive bake-off and then decided from there that it would be something that you could go further with.
Yes, but sourdough didn't play a huge part initially. And the thing that most people liked, I know most sort of artisan bakers start doing just sourdoughs, but I felt there was a real gap in the market talking to people. They found bread boring and it was getting bad press. And they just said, I am so bored. Bread doesn't taste like it used to. And just, the chance to have freshly cooked, good quality, flavoursome bread, they just went mad for it. And that's how it started.
And when you say that bread doesn't taste as it used to, did you work out pretty quickly what the reason was for that?
The reason, I think, are the additives that go into bread now, to be honest, and the fact that it's made in a quick process. And both of those things combine together to change the flavour. The longer you can, when you first mix a bread and knead it, the longer you leave it for the first period of time to prove, it's called the bulk fermentation, the better the flavour. So if you shorten that as much as you can, which commercial bakers have to keep their processes going, it doesn't give it that depth of flavour. So yeah, good ingredients, time, those are the best components for good bread.
So how would you then describe the differences between a sourdough bread and a conventional but baked with love bread?
Okay, time and yeast. So the conventional bread, you use commercial yeast. You can buy it fresh, you can buy it dried. And it's concentrated yeast. It acts quite quickly. A sourdough culture, what is a sourdough culture? Actually, is just flour and water stirred and either kept in a pot on the side in your kitchen or in the fridge, in my case. That sourdough culture contains natural yeasts from the air, from the flour, and over time, the culture develops a really nice balance of acidity and yeast activity. So you use that instead of your commercial yeast. The thing is, it takes quite a lot longer and it isn't as reliable. So it is sensitive to what goes on around, to the temperature, to how long you've left it. It is a little bit sensitive. So it's an art form, really, working with sourdough, but it's really rewarding.
How long did it take you to get the hang of working with sourdough?
If I'm honest, really honest, if you start your own sourdough, it will take about 3 to 4 months for the culture to be the right balance of acid and yeast and to be mature enough to be producing really nice bread. You'll notice it improve almost week on week on week. To be confident as a sort of commercial baker, about a year. But that's different. I was trying to produce, 30, 40 sourdough loaves at a time. When it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. It's fine when it's at home, but when you're actually selling the product, you sort of have to get it right.
Yeah.
And I made mistakes, classic mistakes of too much salt. Salt inhibits yeast activity, and I just made a mistake in my calculations and put too much salt in and had sourdough that was as flat as pancakes. And so about a year from a commercial point of view, but for a home baker, you can start almost straight away and get nice results, but they will get better and better, and just experiment and keep going.
The flavour of a sourdough, if people haven't tried it, is quite different. It has definitely got that tang to it.
It can vary, actually. It's interesting. The amount of tang you can vary, and it's usually correlates to how long it's been left to prove, how much of the sort of actual sourdough culture you use in it in the first place. There's a whole variety of factors, so you can vary it. I mean, I do a fig and sultana loaf that you wouldn't know was sourdough, but it is. It's completely sourdough, and it's beautiful. It's soft, doesn't have any sourness to it. So you can learn to vary the flavours a bit. But the texture is usually not as soft as a commercial loaf or a home-baked yeasted loaf, as I would say. But it has a nice depth of flavour. And over the years, it is, by far the preferred bread in our house by everyone in my house, not just me.
So apart from the flavour side of things, why would you eat or buy a sourdough loaf? What are the potential benefits?
Okay, so the sourdough culture, as I say, it's just flour and water. But over time, there's a build-up of lactic acid. The lactic acid bacteria, they're good bacteria. They kill off the baddies. They're good for gut health. They're good for fermentation. And the theory behind it is that when you then mix your loaf and then you leave it to prove for 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, you can vary it enormously. That changes the structure of the gluten in the loaf, and it changes the phytic acid. So phytic acid, I think, surrounds the grains and actually makes it hard to get the nutrients out of it. But when the sourdough culture gets to work in a nice environment for it, it breaks that down. So it makes the nutrients more accessible. And funnily enough, particularly it turned out for me, it changes the structure of the gluten. And if you become gluten sensitive, which I have become, it becomes tolerable. So about 2 years into the bakery, I was having real problems with arthritis, but in particular, the joints in my hands were swelling all the time. And occasionally my stomach would swell, but it was mainly my hands that were causing the problem. And I was doing a bit of reading around it. I talked to the doctor, and it was suggested, you could try gluten-free diet. And I was like, as a baker, no, please don't. But I was already making some gluten-free breads for customers, which I did on a different day. And I thought, well, I can eat that. They're not as nice as glutinous breads, it has to be said. And within 3 days, I was a different woman. Much less pain, no swelling. So after about 3 days, I was a completely new woman, honestly. I could get my rings on and off. I could make a fist with my hand. I couldn't do that before. I couldn't actually close my hand. They were so sore. And I thought, oh, this is dreadful. Here I am. I'm a baker. What am I going to do? And I was making my sourdough breads already, and I started reading around. I tried using spelt, which I make a spelt bread anyway, but I still was reacting to that. So I was monitoring really carefully what I reacted to. And I found I could tolerate sourdough. And I've since read up on it. And yes, that is quite common. The thing you have to watch out for, though, before everybody rushes out and buys supermarket sourdough, is the important thing is to find sourdough that is made in the time-honoured, long period of time fermenting way. Quite often in supermarkets, what's termed sourdough has commercial yeast added to make it a reliable rise and a quicker rise. But actually that takes away the benefit that you're getting from the sourdough. So if you're buying in a supermarket, ask questions. If there are ingredients on the label, check there's no added yeast. Talk to the bakers and see. Best to go for an artisan bakery, though.
Absolutely. Well, I can vouch for that. If you put the two next to each other flavour wise, I mean, you just get a completely different experience from it. And it also, the other thing about sourdough I found is that it seems to last longer.
Oh, yes, definitely.
So you think, oh, this is quite expensive for a loaf, but you'll buy it and you'll use every bit of it, even in warmer temperatures, rather than finding that it goes off in the plastic bag.
Yes, quite. And the flavour changes over the time as well, which is quite interesting. And if you've never tried sourdough toast, you have to. It just makes the best toast.
Yeah, it really does. There's something about the kind of crunchiness, but then the crumb inside, it's just really overall good. Yeah. So you were getting the hang of the sourdough, you put that into the bakery. What was it like when you were at your height? You know, you were baking a lot of bread. I
was baking a lot of bread. It was known in our house as bonkers bread sometimes. A typical bake day, I tended to do it once a week, all to order, and it would be up to 90 loaves and maybe 150 pastries of some description as well, all out of my double oven in the kitchen. And it would mean starting at sort of 4 a.m. and not finishing till about 7 p.m. if I was lucky. But that got too much. It just got too much in the end. I need hip surgery, and being on your feet for that level of time, being really physical, moving stuff around, handling kilos of dough, that's just been too challenging. So sadly my weekly bakes have gone, and I'm focusing on teaching and doing the odd pop-up event as well. So I'm enjoying that.
So when you do the teaching, what kind of different loaves and methods are you teaching your students?
I teach a range of courses. I do a sourdough course. It's quite a challenge to fit it all into a one day from start to finish. And I tend to keep that to the summer because it's easier to manage. The warm temperature of the room, the outside atmosphere really helps in terms of the speed with sourdough in that instance. But I do breads for beginners, I do pastry courses, I do seasonal breads. I did a very successful Christmas bakes course. So a whole variety of things. And participants come and they learn to make usually 4 breads on the day. They have a 2-course lunch, and there are only 4 participants. So we spend a lot of time getting to know the feel of bread. And I think that is the most important thing. People worry about following a recipe and they worry it's, too wet. And but during the course of the day, they'll handle the dough repeatedly and feel how it changes when you work with it, and how it changes so that you know when it's ready or when it's not ready. And with just 4 people in the class, we spend a lot of time sort of poking each other's dough and, adding more water. It's usually adding more water, never flour. That's the biggest mistake I think most novice bread makers make, is they keep adding flour because they think it's too wet. It's not. Don't add flour.
Because it does change as you start to knead.
As you start to knead, about 5 or 6 minutes in, suddenly it'll start to become more elastic, more cohesive, less sticky. So my rule of thumb is never add any more flour until at least 5 or 6 minutes in. If it's still a complete nightmare in terms of wetness, then start to add a bit. But until that point, don't, because you're just drying out the bread, basically, making it more brick-like in the end product.
What are the other big problems that people come up against, particularly with sourdough, and any solutions that you've got?
people worry that they've killed their starter. There is a book by a chap called Andrew Whitley, who's also ex-BBC, and he has a great chapter in there called "Have I Killed My Starter?" and other frequently asked questions. And the answer is, it is actually quite hard to kill your starter. You might think you have, but you haven't. You just need to get a feel for when it needs feeding, when you need to chuck most of it away. He is a proponent that you actually don't need to feed your starter in the fridge. It can sit there for months, years. So all these people panic about their sourdough mother, as it's called, in the fridge. He says, don't worry about it. I do like to feed mine on a weekly basis in the fridge. So I open it up, I take out quite a bit, and then I add roughly equal amounts of flour and water to what's left in the bottom of the pot. And then I pop it back in the fridge. And that way the acidic content doesn't get too much, because if the acidic content gets too much, it starts to overwhelm the yeast activity. Then I like to just feed what I've taken out once or twice, and then it's brilliant. It's on fine form. Bring it up to room temperature, feed it with equal amounts of flour, water and sourdough culture. Feed it again 12 hours later, and by this time it's bubbling, it's active, it's really ready to go, looks really healthy. If you don't feed your sourdough in the fridge, it just will take you a couple more days to get it back up to where you want it to be. So the thing with sourdough, you can read any number of books and there will be many different ways of doing your sourdough. And I know I got a bit overwhelmed and I was like, should I be doing this or should I be doing that? Actually, just find something that suits your lifestyle, that suits the time that you've got. And then it will work. You know, when you read the recipes, some use more sourdough starter, others use less. The difference will then be in the amount of time you need to leave it to prove. So just find baker's recipe that seems to work for you, and just then work with that till you get your skills up and your confidence up, and then you can begin to experiment some more. So yeah, another really good one I can recommend is James Morton, who was on the Bake Off several years ago. He was a trainee doctor. I think he now is a doctor. And he has a book called Brilliant Bread. And he just makes it work around your lifestyle. You know, people panic. They say, oh, it says I've got to leave it for so long, or I've got to fold it every hour. And it doesn't matter if you don't fold it every hour, or if it's an hour and a quarter, or if it's 2 hours, or actually you can pop the whole lot in the fridge and deal with it in the evening rather than now. You know, you need to relax a bit around it. Don't worry so much. It's not quite like making a cake where if you get it wrong, it goes catastrophically, you know, it goes wrong completely quite quickly. Bread is very forgiving usually, but just keep trying.
I must admit, I was doing a lot of experiments with this when I was writing the book. I'd always liked baking, but I'd never tried sourdough myself. And it almost reminded me of the process of having a pet. So it was like when I first started trying to kind of train or grow my sourdough, it was really demanding, mixing the flour and water, and sometimes there would be explosive mess all over the kitchen. Not that I'm saying that reminds me in any way of when I had the puppy. And then gradually I became a lot less neurotic about it as well, which I think is the same with having a puppy or a baby or anything that's new into the household. And it became more of a coexistence, but it would still sometimes do something unexpected. But in a way, a bit like an animal as well, it's something that you do have to take care of and not completely forget about. But it's very rewarding when you want to use it or when you want to make the bread.
It is. It is. You do have to take care of it, but it's much more enjoyable when you don't fret about it. And I think the thing is, when you take care of it, that you focus on it. And it's like the process of making bread. If you rush things and you're thinking about other things, that's when it doesn't work. I mean, I made a couple of loaves the other day. I had somebody coming to the house to interview me, and she turned up, and I wanted to have, doughs at different stages and all this sort of thing. And she left, and it wasn't quite what we ended up talking about something a bit different. So I hadn't used this dough, and it sort of got left. And then I tried, sort of doing this and doing that and the other. And then it just never quite worked properly, and I was a bit sort of embarrassed when it came out of the oven. It still tasted nice, but it wasn't my normal sort of quality of sourdough bake. And it's when you're doing it, you need to concentrate on what you're doing. But when you leave it, and it just needs a bit of focus from time to time, and definitely get to know it. It does sort of have a bit of a personality. I don't give mine a name or anything daft like that, but
some people do though, don't they? I know that some people give their starters and mothers for all sorts of probiotic ingredients. They call them different things.
Yeah, and it's just be kind to it and be nice to it, and it'll be nice back to you, sort of thing. So that's why I feed mine every week. I try and use it in different ways, and you'll get, the more you do that, the more you will get to understand how it works and what it does in your kitchen, in your environment. Different places are very different. You know, I live in a very hard water area. I don't know what it's like down with you, but occasionally that's a bit challenging. But sometimes what I've found, but I never always remembered to do it, especially when I was doing the big bulk bakes, is you can measure out, or roughly measure out, the water that you're going to use in your mix and leave it out for 6, 7, 8 hours uncovered. Perhaps, you know, maybe a light tea towel over the top or something very thin if you want to keep, you know, dog hairs from floating in or something like that. But basically that then allows the chlorine to evaporate off from the water. And then, because the chlorine is a bleach, so it's going to inhibit yeast growth. So that's one tip that you can use in a hard water area where the sourdough finds it a bit more challenging, shall we say. But it's also, you know, houses are really different. Even in my house, I would put doughs in different parts of the house or outside in the garden, depending on what I thought they needed at the time. If I needed to get them moving along, or if I needed to slow them down, because the oven was chock-a-block for the next 2 hours. You know, you can play around and find what works for you. It's a very enjoyable journey. I would always say, for a novice sourdough baker, jot down what you've done each time and then see what you think the results are, so that next time you can vary it a bit. Or if you think, did that work? You know, try something different and see if it makes a difference to you. That's
I also use my alarm on my phone actually to remind me when I had like lots of different things on the go, to remind myself this is the time to feed this is the time, because I was making kefir and yogurt and things as well, and you know, they've all got slightly different needs. And my menagerie, you know, I had to make sure that I wasn't going to let one thing die off, like a Tamagotchi. Remember those old ones?
Yes, I always kill those off.
But not your sourdough, so that's the main thing.
Not my sourdoughs, no.
So what's the thing for you with bread now? So are you able to eat some of it? Are you eating more gluten-free bread with your own sensitivities?
I prefer to eat just sourdough bread, to be honest. I have a gluten-free recipe that I use, which is a nice sort of walnutty, seedy loaf, which is quite nice, and I just have that sliced in the freezer and I use that. But my preference is for sourdough. The most exciting thing that's happened to me in the last 6 months is mastering sourdough croissant, because the thing that I missed most in the world was something like a pastry. I have a bit of a sweet tooth, and being gluten-free has generally cured that, because I just look at stuff now because I know it makes me feel really rubbish, so I no longer want to eat it. But I'd always look in sort of drooling at croissant and think, I could just eat a croissant. And actually, like most things, you can use sourdough to make your croissant. It takes a long time, but I found a baker who was making croissant, and I quizzed him and I said, well, do you ever make sourdough croissant in your bakery? And he went, no, that it just takes too long. It takes about 3 days.
Right.
And includes a lot of time where, you know, it takes 9-10 hours for each croissant to rise. So that takes up a lot of trays, a lot of space, a lot of time. So I quizzed them and said, well, if you were doing it sourdough, how much starter would you add rather than the yeast and all this sort of thing? And I went home and experimented. Oh, my goodness. If I tell people they're sourdough croissants, they go, And that's one thing about the name, because of the sour, they think, ooh, I'm not going to like it. But every single time they prefer the sourdough croissant to the yeasty croissant. There's just something about the depth of flavour, the crispiness, the crunch, flakiness. And actually they're easier to control shape-wise because it never gets out of control. Making yeasty croissants is very challenging, particularly when it gets warm, because it just goes ahead of you and it starts absorbing the butter too quickly and all this sort of thing. But no, a sourdough croissant takes about 3 days to make. Just mix it. You don't even need it, because the length of time that it sits, it does the work on its own. That's one thing with kneading. If you don't like kneading bread, you can just leave it longer and it will happen naturally. The gluten development will happen naturally. So it's really quite an eye-opener for people that they could make croissant quite easily. The tricky bit is learning how to layer the butter effectively, but once you've got the hang of it, that's great, it's fine. But no,
can you then freeze the dough? Is that something practical?
I don't, because I only have a small freezer. But yes, you could freeze the dough. So even at the height, I just had a big household fridge and a small freezer, and it got to the point where I was looking at professional ovens and all this sort of thing. But then I would have had to turn into a 6-day-a-week operation, and I couldn't do that. Much as I love my bread.
You've obviously had your own issues with gluten. What's your view on the whole people going gluten-free or clean eating and those kind of trends that come on with eating?
Before I was diagnosed as being gluten sensitive, I have to admit to being like a bit sort of wary of the whole gluten-free aspect. Sort of thought it's a fad. But having seen the difference it made to me, and I know if I eat something that inadvertently does have gluten in, my body lets me know. Not instantly, and it doesn't affect my digestive system so much. Occasionally I will bloat, but about 4 to 6 hours later, suddenly the inflammation in my joints will start, and it'll go on for 10 hours or so. And so going gluten-free really made a difference for me. And the other thing is, it is actually quite hard to go gluten-free. Yes. Gluten-free bread is awful most of the time. Yeah. It's a real pain. So actually, I think most people, if they treat it as a bit of a faddy thing, they won't stick to it. You only stick to it if you know it's actually sort of helping you. But I think my philosophy is be open to thinking about new ways of eating and to be open to try new things. But for me, really, the simpler it is, the better it is. So definitely I'm going right against sort of processed foods now, trying to cook from fresh as much as I can, trying to eat as healthily as I can, and just trying on different levels to sort of keep the good stuff up. I don't think there's ever a quick, simple fix to anything in life. And I busted my knee 7 years ago, and it took a long time to get it back to full mobility. And it wasn't one particular thing. It was doing this, and it was doing that, and it was doing that. And if any of those sort of slipped back into the bad habits, my knee wouldn't do as well. But one thing on their own didn't just make the difference. So I think, with diet, it's, yes, have your chocolate, have your cake sometimes, definitely have your wine. But on the whole, if you're trying to watch your weight and whatever, you need to be wary of what you're doing. At the moment, I'm trying to work out, because I do react to some of the foods, and I'm keeping a food diary. And that is actually really, it's quite difficult to do. It's actually quite good at helping me see what I'm putting in my mouth. And I have made some basic switches, which I think are really good. Yeah, I would say keep a varied diet, try and up some of the good stuff and have less of the bad stuff. So I would say good homemade bread, with or without sourdough, is better than processed bread, definitely, would be a good way to go.
It's diversity, isn't it? I mean, that's our kind of thing, that really people have found helpful, I think, in trying out the dirty diet idea generally, is we talk about as much diversity of as unfussed with ingredients as possible, because the more different things you eat, the less likely you are to develop an intolerance. We're not saying that gluten-free is a bad thing if you find that you react, but it's about listening to your body rather than listening to the latest fad person saying that, for example, gluten or bread in itself is bad for you, because it's nonsense if you don't have an intolerance or you're not celiac to cut out an entire group of foods like carbs or grains, because they have so many potential benefits.
Yeah.
But you need to be listening as well to what's doing, whether that's through a food diary or whether it is just being conscious and noticing that you have a particular effect from a particular food.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the one thing with sourdough, and celiac, you mentioned celiac disease, there is some emerging evidence that celiacs can tolerate sourdough, but it really is emerging evidence. So the advice really still is at the moment, if you are celiac, that you do not go near wheat at all. But that advice may change in future years. But certainly if you're gluten sensitive, it is definitely worth a go. The bad thing I had to do, because I'd gone gluten-free, was then go back onto gluten to be tested for celiac. Oh dear. Awful.
Yes. Yeah, because if you are celiac, you have to be, the test only works to show that up if you've actually been eating it, doesn't it? If you've actually been consuming gluten. So
yeah, and you have to go back onto it for about, some say 6 weeks, but my doctor let me off with 2.
At least you knew that you weren't that, so you could still eat it now and then.
Yeah.
But rather than having to kind of do it all the time.
Yes, and not to panic if something crept in, because some celiacs who came to me for gluten-free bread, any microscopic sort of amount of gluten in there would be causing them problems. Whereas, if you're just gluten sensitive, it's not. The minutest traces in there, it doesn't really matter, but it does if you're celiac. You really do need to be careful as to what you're consuming.
Did you have that sensitivity diagnosed, or was it just based on data on your own records?
It's interesting. It was, I was tested for an allergic reaction and didn't show, though I can tell you when I work with rye dough, my hands go bright red.
Wow.
It's the different, whether it's the grain, something in the grain, I don't know, but my hands will go bright red. And years ago, I'd had a sort of commercial allergy test, and it had shown very mild sensitivity to rye, wheat, barley, as well as eggs and milk. And the advice was, if you're not having symptoms, then that's fine. You don't need to do anything. But if you're having symptoms, you might want to reduce. And I sort of completely forgot about that. The egg I've never agreed with, but always comes up when I have allergy tests. They always say I'm allergic to egg. And when I had the allergy test done at the doctor, they said no to a wheat allergy. But he said, you are quite clearly reacting. I showed him pictures of my hands and my tummy, described the symptoms. And he went, well, it's quite clearly your body is reacting in some way. Give it a go, and if it works.
But the odd bit of sourdough is kind of
sourdough. I have sourdough most days, but I won't have it sort of at breakfast and lunch. I'll just have it a bit, but it's lovely. And I've now also learnt it's quite hard to find a recipe. Sourdough pastry. They're like a short crust pastry, and you, instead of adding water to it, you add sourdough starter to it till it comes together, and then you leave it out basically to ferment a bit overnight, and then you pop it in the fridge, and then whenever you're ready, then you roll it out, and it's beautifully short, beautifully crunchy, and it means I can eat pastry again.
That's really brilliant. So, and again, more evidence that it's not just proving, it's also acting on that phytic acid.
Yeah, absolutely. It's working on it and sort of changing the structure so that it's more tolerant to you. So that's the one thing with sourdough. People get a bit worried that they're chucking away loads of the flour and water mix of sourdough culture. But you can, I make crackers, I make pastry now, I'm doing my sourdough croissant. So you can get into doing quite a few other things. We can give it to friends as well.
That's true. Once you've got a nice stable starter, which is the bit that takes some of the trial and error to begin with.
Yeah.
Give it away.
give it away.
Yeah. So I'm sure that you've inspired people. Where can they find out more about the baking that you do and the bakery at number 55 and your courses?
So my website is www.thebakeryattnumber55.co.uk. So number is spelt out and 55 is the number. Or Facebook as well. You can look at Bakery at Number 55. Details of my courses are on there. And because I've now had to switch to mainly doing teaching, I'm hoping to do a bit more on the website in terms of hints and tips to get people going, because it's lovely to see other people get excited about making their own bread. It's wonderful. I got sent somebody sent me, one of my customers who was sort of bereft that I'd stopped doing my Friday bakes. I'd given her some of my culture, and I give my culture away. I don't sell it because it is, after all, flour and water. But it just has been brewing a nice long length of time. She sent me a whole sequence of photos, and it's fabulous. And she's making as good a loaf as I can do now. And that's absolutely brilliant. And she's delighted. She's absolutely thrilled that she's sort of nailed it. Just try and keep trying and it'll come.
Frances, thank you. That is such a lot of fantastic information there. And I know people will be looking at your site and hopefully being able to learn from the master in person. Thank you for joining us today.
So much brilliant information in there from Frances, and I love her attitude to food and to finding innovative ways to keep enjoying the bread and the croissants and the other foods that she really enjoys. And if you want to learn more about fermentation and using friendly bacteria to make your food even more delicious, there's a lot more in the Dirty Diet. Ditch the guilt, love your food. I've got a whole section there about making your own kefir and sourdough starters and yogurt and so on. Tried them all with sometimes explosive results in my own kitchen. It was a very exciting summer last year when I was doing the experimentation, and I still involve a lot of these foods in my day-to-day diet. Great fun. If you want to get hold of your free blueprint, which will explore how you can improve your health and end up being a stable and healthy weight by eating more in many cases than you were eating before and eating more widely, you can download it via thedirty-diet.com, or you can also find it in the show notes for this episode. You can also get some of my favourite recipes that way too. Next time, I am going to be back talking dirty with dietitian Helen Fadness. We're going to be talking about why carbs make us human and sharing our carbohydrate top of the pops. That's it for today's Live Happy, Eat Dirty. For free tools and tips to help you live a gloriously imperfect way of life, go to thedirty-diet.com or find us on Facebook/The Dirty Diet. You can also tweet me at Kate Writes Books. And do have a happy and dirty day.